Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The year is 1768. In the gilded halls of Topkapi Palace, Sultan Mustafa III, a ruler burning with ambition to restore Ottoman glory, makes a fateful decision. He declares war on a rising, formidable power, Catherine the Great's Russia. It was a gamble fueled by pride and a profound underestimation of his enemy. This single decision would unleash a storm of fire and steel across the Black Sea, shatter an empire's illusion of invincibility, and seal the Sultan's tragic fate. This is the story of the man who wagered everything and lost. In the heart of the Topkapi Palace, a world of unimaginable opulence and lethal paranoia, a prince waited. His name was Mustafa, son of the deposed Sultan Ahmed III, the great patron of the tulip era. But for Mustafa, there were no tulips, only the cold, gilded bars of the Kafes, the cage. This was not a literal cage of iron, but a suite of luxurious apartments that served as a prison for potential heirs to the Ottoman throne. For 27 years, from the deposition of his father until his own ascension, this was his world. Every sunrise was a reprieve, every sunset a potential prelude to the arrival of the executioner's silken cord. The fate of his brother, who had been strangled to secure his cousin's throne, was a ghost that haunted every gilded corner of his prison. This long, suffocating isolation forged the man who would become Sultan. Deprived of worldly experience, he turned inward. He became a student of calligraphy, a composer of poetry, and a devout follower of astrology, searching for destiny in the stars because his own was so uncertain on earth. He watched the empire from a distance, through the whispers of loyal eunuchs and the filtered news of the court. He saw the defeats, the treaties that chipped away at Ottoman pride, the stagnation that settled like dust on the glorious legacy of his ancestors. A quiet, burning resentment took root in his soul, a conviction that he, and he alone, could restore the tarnished honor of the House of Osman. The Kafes was designed to produce docile, broken princes, men too terrified to challenge the reigning sultan. But in Mustafa, it created the opposite. A man whose ambitions simmered for decades, a ruler in waiting who dreamed not of survival, but of conquest and vengeance against the forces he believed were humbling his empire. When the doors of the Kafes finally opened for him, it was not a broken man who emerged, but a 40-year-old sultan with a lifetime of waiting to avenge. In 1757, the throne of Osman, once the most powerful seat on earth, fell to Mustafa III. He was 40 years old, a man whose prime years had been stolen by the gilded cage. He inherited an empire that was a shadow of its former self. The treasury was depleted by courtly excess and costly, indecisive wars. The military, once the terror of Christendom, was a hollow institution, its famed janissaries more adept at palace intrigue than modern warfare. The ashes of past defeats, the loss of Hungary, the humiliating treaties of Passarowitz and Belgrade, were cold, but the memory of their sting was fresh. This was the throne he had dreamed of for nearly 3 decades, a throne of ashes. But Mustafa was not a man to be defined by his inheritance. He was defined by his ambition. Immediately upon his accession, he displayed a vigor unseen in the palace for generations. He slashed extravagant court spending, melted down gold and silver ornaments to mint new coins, and demanded accountability from his pashas. He was pious, yes, but his piety was that of a Ghazi, a holy warrior. He saw himself as the sword of Islam, destined to reclaim what was lost. His gaze turned northward, toward the vast, expanding empire of the Tsars. Russia, under the formidable Empress Catherine the Great, was the rising power, the primary challenger to Ottoman dominance in the Black Sea and the Balkans. In Catherine, Mustafa saw a rival. In Russia, he saw an existential threat and an opportunity for glory. His long years of confinement had not made him cautious. They had made him certain. He believed the Ottoman decline was not a matter of systemic failure, but of weak leadership and impiety. He was the cure, He would be the strong leader, the pious caliph who would marshal the empire's resources and lead it back to greatness. The court, accustomed to pliable or indifferent sultans, was electrified by his energy. But beneath the surface, his ambition was a dangerous fire, fueled by a profound misunderstanding of the new world order that had taken shape while he was locked away, dreaming of the past. Mustafa III was more than just a would-be conqueror. He was a man who understood, on a fundamental level, that something was deeply rotten within the state of the Ottoman military. His ambition was not entirely blind. He knew that to challenge the rising might of Russia, the rusty sword of the empire had to be reforged. And so, the Sultan became a reformer, embarking on a project that was as dangerous as it was necessary. He turned his attention to the artillery, the arm of the military where European advances had been most dramatic. He knew the old bronze cannons of the Janissaries were no match for the mobile, rapid-firing field guns of the West. He sought foreign expertise, a deeply controversial move that flew in the face of Ottoman pride. His most notable collaborator was the Franco-Hungarian nobleman, Baron de Tott, a brilliant and adventurous artillery officer. Under the Sultan's patronage, de Tott helped establish a new, modern artillery corps, the Surat Topçuları, or rapid-fire artillerymen, trained in modern European tactics and equipped with more advanced weaponry. Mustafa also founded new institutions, including a naval engineering school, the forerunner of Istanbul's modern technical university, in an attempt to rebuild Ottoman sea power from the keel up. This was his dream, a synthesis of Islamic faith and Western technology, a new model army to restore an old empire. But every dream invites a nightmare. Mustafa's reforms were met with suspicion and outright hostility from the most powerful institution in the empire, the Janissary Corps. For centuries, they had been the Sultan's sword and shield, but now they were a deeply conservative, politically entrenched force that saw any change as a direct threat to their privileged status. They sabotaged new equipment, resisted new training methods, and viewed men like Baron de Tott as infidel interlopers. The Sultan had to tread a razor's edge, pushing for modernization without provoking a Janissary revolt that could easily cost him his throne and his life. His dream of a revitalized military was constantly clashing with the intractable reality of an empire resistant to change. The spark that would ignite the inferno came in 1768 from a small border town called Balta. A skirmish involving Polish nationalists and Russian Cossacks spilled onto Ottoman territory. In another era, it might have been resolved through diplomacy. But in the Istanbul of Mustafa III, it was the pretext the war party had been waiting for. The air in the divan, the imperial council, was thick with hawkish fervour. Influential clerics issued fatwas calling for a holy war. Grand viziers, eager to please their ambitious sultan, painted pictures of easy victories and the reclamation of the Crimea. They spoke of Russian weakness and Ottoman destiny, conveniently ignoring the reports of their own spies about the true strength of Catherine the Great's modernized armies. The cautious voices were gone. The pragmatic Grand Vizier, Kokaragat Pasha, who had wisely kept the empire at peace for years, was dead. In his place were men who told the Sultan what he wanted to hear, that his reforms, though incomplete, were enough, that the piety of his soldiers would triumph over the cold mathematics of modern warfare. Mustafa, a man whose entire reign was a prelude to this moment, was swept up in the tide. His own deep-seated belief in his destiny, his simmering desire to avenge the humiliations of the past, and his profound underestimation of his enemy converged into a single, fatal decision. Ignoring the cautionary advice of his French allies, who knew the true state of both armies, Mustafa III declared war on the Russian Empire. The declaration was met with jubilant crowds in the streets of Istanbul. Banners were unfurled, prayers were offered for victory, and the ancient war machine of the Ottoman Empire began to grind into motion. The Sultan stood at the apex of his power, believing he was on the cusp of restoring the glory of his ancestors. He had pushed his empire to the brink, confident it would soar. He did not realize he had just led it to the edge of a cliff, into a catastrophic war from which it would never truly recover. The die was cast, and a lifetime of ambition was about to meet the brutal reality of the battlefield. While Mustafa III wrestled with the ghosts of past Ottoman glory, a new power was coalescing in the frozen north. It was a power embodied by a woman of formidable intellect and terrifying ambition. Born a minor German princess, she had seized the Russian throne in a coup against her own husband, and now ruled as Catherine II, soon to be known as the Great. She was a student of the Enlightenment, a correspondent of Voltaire, a patron of the arts. But beneath the veneer of philosophy lay a will of iron and a geopolitical vision as vast and cold as the Siberian steppe. Catherine saw Russia not merely as a European power, but as the heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, the Third Rome. And in her eyes, Istanbul, Constantinople, was the prize that would cement this legacy. Her court at the Winter Palace was a glittering stage for this grand ambition. She surrounded herself with brilliant, ruthless men like Grigory Potemkin and Alexei Orlov, men who shared her dream of Russian supremacy. They spoke of the Greek project, a breathtakingly audacious plan to dismember the Ottoman Empire entirely, resurrect a new Byzantine state under Russian protection, and place her own grandson, aptly named Constantine, on its throne. This was not just a strategy for territorial expansion. It was a civilizational crusade cloaked in the language of imperial destiny. Catherine's Russia was a different kind of adversary. It was not just a rival empire. It was an idea in motion. It was modernizing its military, expanding its industry, and harnessing a potent blend of orthodox faith and imperial nationalism. For Catherine, the Black Sea was not a border. It was a Russian lake waiting to be claimed. The Crimean Khanate, a long-standing Ottoman vassal, was not a buffer state. It was a stepping stone. Every move she made, every reform she enacted, was calculated to prepare her empire for the inevitable, final confrontation with the Turks. Mustafa, in his Topkapi Palace, was looking inward, trying to fix a complex, aging machine. Catherine, in her Winter Palace, was looking outward, drawing a new map of the world. The world beyond the Ottoman borders was a treacherous place, a grand chessboard of shifting alliances and simmering rivalries. The ink was barely dry on the treaties that ended the catastrophic 7 Years' War, a conflict that had redrawn the political map and left the old powers exhausted and wary. A diplomatic revolution had turned centuries of tradition on its head. The Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of France, once mortal enemies, were now bound in an uneasy alliance. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, had emerged as a formidable new force in Germany, forever altering the balance of power. For the Ottoman Empire, this new arrangement was deeply unsettling. For centuries, the Sublime Porte had skillfully played European powers against one another, relying heavily on its alliance with France to counter the ambitions of Austria, and more recently, Russia. But now, France was weakened, humbled by its defeat to Great Britain, and its attention was consumed by its burgeoning global rivalry with the British and its own internal financial crises. The French ambassador in Constantinople might still whisper promises of support in the Sultan's ear, but Paris lacked the will and the means to offer any meaningful resistance to Russian expansion. Austria, meanwhile, was a paradox. As a fellow rival of Russia in the Balkans, it should have been a natural Ottoman ally. Yet, the Habsburg court in Vienna also looked greedily upon Ottoman lands, secretly contemplating how they might partition the Sultan's European territories with Catherine if the opportunity arose. Great Britain, the rising maritime power, was a distant and pragmatic player, more concerned with trade routes and its Indian empire than with the fate of the Sultan. The Ottomans were strategically isolated in a way they had never been before. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a cold, transactional diplomacy where the empire was increasingly seen not as a peer, but as a prize. The whispers in the chancelleries of Europe were not about how to help the Sultan, but about how to manage his inevitable decline for their own benefit. A net was closing around Mustafa's empire, woven by the ambitions of his rivals and the indifference of his old friends. The storm that would break over Mustafa's reign did not gather over the Balkans or the Caucasus, but in the sprawling, chaotic lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland was the ghost of a great power, a vast kingdom crippled by a fatal flaw, an elective monarchy. Its king was chosen by the nobility, the szlachta, a system that turned every succession into an auction, inviting foreign powers to meddle, bribe, and intimidate. Poland had become Europe's political playground, and its most dominant player was now Catherine the Great. In 1764, she engineered the election of her former lover, Stanisław August Poniatowski, to the Polish throne. It was a brazen act of political puppetry, effectively turning the Commonwealth into a Russian protectorate. For the Ottoman Empire, this was an alarming development. The Porte had long considered a strong, independent Poland to be a vital buffer against Russian expansion. A Russian-controlled Poland meant that the Tsar's armies were now camped on the Ottoman doorstep. The proud Polish nobility would not accept this humiliation. A group of them formed the Confederation of Bar, a patriotic anti-Russian uprising. They waged a desperate guerrilla war against King Stanislaw and his Russian backers. Outmatched and outgunned, the Confederates looked south for a savior. They sent envoys to Constantinople, appealing to the Sultan as the historic protector of liberties against tyranny. Their pleas resonated within the walls of the Topkapi Palace. Here was a chance to act, to push back against the relentless Russian advance. French diplomats, eager to bog Russia down in a costly war far from their own interests, fanned the flames, assuring the Sultan's ministers of French support and exaggerating the strength of the Polish rebellion. The Polish question became a matter of honor and strategic necessity for the Divan. To ignore the pleas of the Confederates would be to tacitly accept Russia's domination of a key borderland. It would be a sign of weakness, an invitation for further aggression. A conflict in a distant, failing state was about to become the direct catalyst for an imperial war. The Polish spark had landed in the powder keg of Russo-Turkish rivalry. The air in the Imperial Council, the Divan, was thick with tension. The pleas of the Polish Confederates and the provocations of the French ambassador had created a powerful war faction in Constantinople. These were the Hawks, men who believed that Ottoman honor and security demanded a swift, decisive blow against Russian arrogance. They spoke of past glories, of the might of the Janissaries, and of the sacred duty of the Sultan, the Ghazi, to wage war against the encroaching infidel. They argued that to wait was to die a slow death, to be dismembered piece by a calculating empress. Yet, there were voices of caution, men who had studied the reports from the frontiers, who understood the precarious state of the treasury and the dated state of the Ottoman army. They knew that the Janissaries were no longer the invincible force of centuries past, and that the Russian military had been forged and hardened in the brutal school of European warfare. Sultan Mustafa III himself was torn. His instincts were those of a reformer, not a warmonger. He knew the deep-seated problems of his empire could not be solved on a battlefield. He hesitated, seeking a diplomatic path, hoping to contain the crisis without resorting to a full-scale war he was not truly prepared for. But Catherine the Great would not allow him that luxury. In 1768, the final, unforgivable provocation occurred. A unit of Cossacks, loyal to Russia, pursued a band of Polish Confederates across the border and into the Ottoman town of Balta in modern-day Ukraine. They did not stop at the border. They sacked the town, massacring Muslims and Jews alike. The news of the Balta incident struck Constantinople like a thunderclap. It was a direct, bloody violation of Ottoman sovereignty. The debate was over. Public outrage, fanned by the war party, reached a fever pitch. To remain passive now would be an admission of impotence. The Russian ambassador, Obrezhov, was summoned and, in a dramatic breach of diplomatic protocol, thrown into the notorious Yedikule fortress. On October 25, 1768, Mustafa III, his hand forced by circumstance and his judgment clouded by pride, declared war on the Russian Empire. It was the point of no return. A step taken in defense of honor, but one that led his empire to the edge of an abyss, all based on a catastrophic underestimation of the woman who ruled the north. In the gilded halls of the Topkapi Palace, war was a matter of principle, a righteous response to Russian transgression in Poland. For Sultan Mustafa III, it was a holy cause, a chance to restore Ottoman prestige. In the autumn of 1768, the imperial standards were unfurled, and the declaration of war was issued with solemn fanfare. The Grand Vizier, Mehmed Emin Pasha, a man whose confidence far outstripped his military acumen, promised the Sultan a swift and glorious victory. He saw the Russian bear as a lumbering beast, easily outmaneuvered by the speed and fury of the Ottoman war machine, particularly the fearsome Crimean Tatar cavalry. The initial campaigns of 1769 seemed to validate this optimism, at least on the surface. Tatar raids swept deep into Russian territory, returning with plunder and prisoners, creating an illusion of dominance. The first major confrontation occurred at the formidable fortress of Kotin on the Dniester River. The Ottoman garrison initially repulsed Russian assaults, sending triumphant messages back to Istanbul. These early reports were intoxicating for Mustafa. He saw the hand of Providence at work, rewarding his piety and punishing the infidels. But the reality on the ground was far grimmer. The Ottoman supply lines were a disaster, and the army was plagued by indiscipline. While the court celebrated phantom victories, Mehmed Emin Pasha's Grand Army failed to decisively engage the enemy. When the Russians, under General Alexander Golitsyn, finally mounted a determined siege of Kotin, the overextended and starving Ottoman relief force disintegrated. The fortress fell. Mehmed Emin Pasha was disgraced and executed, a scapegoat for a systemic failure. Yet even this catastrophe was not enough to shatter the Sultan's resolve. In his mind, this was a failure of a single man, not the failure of his vision. He replaced the vizier, renewed his proclamations, and poured more gold into the war effort, convinced that the next campaign would bring the triumph he so desperately craved. It was a hope built on a foundation of sand, a dangerous self-deception that would soon be washed away by a tide of Russian steel. The campaign season of 1770 dawned with a chilling new reality. The Russian war machine was not the clumsy giant the Divan had imagined. It was methodical, disciplined, and under the command of a man who would become the bane of the Ottoman Empire, General Pyotr Rumyantsev. He was not a man of grand pronouncements, but of cold, calculated violence. His objective was clear: to advance south, shatter the Ottoman armies in Moldavia, and seize control of the Danube frontier. The first major test came on July 7, 1770, along the marshy banks of the Laga River. The Ottoman commander, Kaplan Giray, Khan of Crimea, had assembled a formidable force of nearly 80,000 men, a swirling mass of Tatar horsemen and Ottoman infantry. They faced Rumyantsev's army of less than 40,000. On paper, it was an overwhelming Ottoman advantage. The Tatar cavalry, famed for its lightning charges, was expected to envelop and annihilate the smaller Russian force. But Rumyantsev was a student of modern warfare. He understood that the age of the cavalry charge was being eclipsed by the age of disciplined firepower. He arranged his infantry into hollow squares, bristling hedges of bayonets and muskets that could repel attacks from any direction, supported by well-placed artillery. As the Tatar horde surged forward in a thunderous wave, they did not find a panicked line to break. They crashed against the unyielding walls of the Russian squares. Volley after volley of devastating musket fire tore through their ranks. The charges faltered, broke, and dissolved into chaos. The elite horsemen of the steppe were rendered impotent by tactical innovation. With the Tatar cavalry neutralized, Rumyantsev turned his attention to the main Ottoman camp. The methodical Russian advance, a relentless march of infantry and cannon, unnerved the Ottoman commanders. Their army, a coalition of disparate units, lacked the cohesion and discipline to withstand the pressure. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. What should have been a decisive victory became a humiliating rout. The Ottomans and their allies fled the field, leaving behind their camp, their artillery, and their pride. The Lager was not the largest battle of the war, but it was a terrifying omen. It was here, on the banks of this forgotten river, that the myth of Ottoman martial superiority began to die. Just 2 weeks after the disaster at Lager, the new Grand Vizier, Ivazade Halil Pasha, was determined to avenge the defeat and crush Rumyantsev once and for all. He gathered the full might of the Ottoman army near the Kagul River. It was a force of staggering size, at least 150,000 men, a sprawling city of soldiers, camp followers, and cannons, stretching for miles. Facing this behemoth was Rumyantsev, with a force that had now dwindled to perhaps 30,000 effective soldiers. The odds were more than 5 to 1. To any rational military mind, the Russian position was untenable, suicidal. Halil Pasha was so confident of victory that he promised his troops rich rewards and planned the celebrations in advance. But Rumyantsev did not think in terms of odds. He thought in terms of weakness. He saw not a mighty army, but a disorganized, poorly led, and demoralized mob. And he chose to do the unthinkable. He attacked. On the morning of July 21st, 1770, under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, the Russian columns advanced. They moved with a chilling silence and precision, organized into massive divisional squares. They slammed into the left flank of the sprawling Ottoman camp, catching the elite janissaries completely by surprise. The Ottoman response was sluggish and chaotic. Instead of a coordinated defense, individual units fought and fled on their own. The janissaries, fierce in a frontal assault, were bewildered by the disciplined, all-around firepower of the Russian squares. As cannonballs ripped through their tents and musket volleys cut down their ranks, a seed of panic took root. The critical moment came when Rumyantsev's artillery began to bombard the main Ottoman camp. The psychological impact was immense. The vast army, which had felt so invincible just hours before, began to dissolve. Command and control vanished. It became a rout on an unimaginable scale. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled for the Danube, pursued and cut down by Russian cavalry. The Grand Vizier himself barely escaped with his life. By the end of the day, one of the largest armies the Ottoman Empire had ever fielded had ceased to exist. It had evaporated in a single morning of terror and confusion, defeated by a force a fraction of its size. The news from Kagul struck Istanbul like a thunderbolt, shaking the empire to its very foundations and plunging Sultan Mustafa into a state of profound despair. While his armies were being shattered on the plains of Moldavia, Sultan Mustafa III believed one bastion of Ottoman power remained unassailable: the sea. The Ottoman navy was the master of the Aegean and the Black Sea, a fleet of majestic ships of the line that projected the Sultan's power across the waves. The idea that Russia, a nation with no warm water ports, could challenge this supremacy was laughable. But Catherine the Great possessed an audacity that matched Mustafa's piety. In a move of breathtaking ambition, she dispatched her Baltic fleet from its frozen ports on a 7,000-mile journey around the entire continent of Europe. It was a logistical nightmare, a voyage plagued by storms and disease. But in 1770, the impossible happened. A Russian fleet, commanded by Alexei Orlov, appeared in the Greek archipelago. The Ottoman Naval Command, under Kapudan Pasha Mandalzade Hüsameddin, was caught completely off guard. After an indecisive initial engagement, the Ottoman commander made a fatal error. Seeking a defensible position to repair his ships, he ordered his entire fleet of over 70 vessels to anchor in the tight, narrow confines of Chesma Bay on the Turkish coast. He had trapped himself. On the night of July 5th, 1770, the Russians saw their chance. Under the guidance of British naval advisors, they launched a daring night attack. A handful of Russian ships bombarded the Ottoman fleet to create confusion, but the real weapon was fire. 4 old merchant vessels had been converted into fireships, packed with explosives and combustibles. Guided by brave crews, these floating bombs sailed directly into the heart of the densely packed Ottoman fleet. One of them, commanded by Lieutenant Dmitry Ilyin, successfully grappled onto an 84-gun Ottoman flagship. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. The flagship blew apart in a massive fireball, showering the surrounding ships with burning debris. A terrifying chain reaction began. Ship after ship caught fire, their cannons cooking off and firing randomly into the night. The calm bay transformed into a vision of hell, a sea of fire from which there was no escape. By dawn, the Ottoman navy had been annihilated. Over 11,000 sailors were dead. A fleet that had taken decades to build was reduced to smouldering ash in a single night. For Sultan Mustafa, the news was incomprehensible. His armies were broken, and now his fleet was gone. The sea itself had turned against him. The summer of 1770 began with a suffocating heat in Constantinople, but the true fire was yet to come. For months, Sultan Mustafa III had received reports of a Russian fleet, a phantom armada that had sailed from the frozen Baltic, circumnavigating an entire continent. His admirals had scoffed. The idea was preposterous, a journey no navy had ever dared. They assured their Padishah that the Russian bear could not swim. They were catastrophically wrong. In the calm waters of the Aegean, at a bay near Chesma, the Ottoman navy, a magnificent but complacent force, was cornered. The Russian commander, Alexei Orlov, was not a seasoned admiral, but a ruthless court favorite. He saw his opportunity not for a battle of cannons, but for an inferno. Using fireships, the Russians turned the crowded Ottoman anchorage into a floating pyre. The news, when it finally reached the Topkapi Palace, was not delivered by a triumphant Capudan Pasha, but by terrified fishermen who had seen the sky turn red from 100 miles away. An entire imperial fleet, the pride of the Sublime Porte, had been annihilated in a single night. The psychological shockwave was greater than any military defeat on land. The Dardanelles, the sacred gateway to the capital, was now undefended. Panic, a sentiment unknown in the heart of the empire for generations, gripped the city. Merchants shuttered their shops. Women whispered prayers in the harems. On the Bosphorus, the guards stared eastward, imagining Russian sails appearing on the horizon at any moment. For Mustafa III, the man who had so eagerly sought this war, the smoke from Chesma choked his ambitions and filled his palace with the stench of his own colossal misjudgment. The empire was no longer inviolable. Its heart was exposed, beating in terror. In the Ottoman system, disaster required a sacrifice. The throne itself could not be seen to fail. Therefore, the man who served it must pay the price. As the ashes of the fleet settled and the Russian army advanced relentlessly in the Balkans, Sultan Mustafa III's gaze fell upon his Grand Vizier, Mehmed Emin Pasha. He was a man of competence, but competence was no shield against a sultan's fury and a dynasty's desperation. The Grand Vizier had overseen the war effort, had signed the dispatches, had assured his master of victory. Now, every lost battle, every burned ship, was a stain on his name, a weight pulling him toward the executioner's block. The politics of the divan became a viper's nest. Whispers turned to accusations. Rivals saw their chance to rise on the back of a falling man. They reminded Mustafa of the vizier's confidence, twisting it into arrogance. They painted his caution as cowardice. Mustafa, besieged by failure and paranoia, needed a release for the pressure building within the empire. He needed to show the populace, the janissaries, and God himself that the failure was one of man, not of the sacred office of the Sultan. The order was given. There was no trial, no grand ceremony, only the quiet, chilling finality of imperial power. Mehmed Emin Pasha was dismissed, arrested, and swiftly executed. His head, as was tradition, was presented to the Sultan as proof that the deed was done. But this act of brutal scapegoating solved nothing. It did not rebuild the navy, nor did it halt the Russian advance. It only deepened the climate of fear within the palace, proving that the price of advising Mustafa III could be one's life. The Sultan had purged the symbol of his failure, but the failure itself remained, a cancer growing at the core of his empire. With his fleet gone and his armies in disarray, Mustafa III retreated into the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace. The public pronouncements remained defiant, but behind the high walls, the Sultan was a man tormented. He was a poet, a man of faith, a ruler who genuinely believed he was destined to restore the glory of his ancestors. This war was to be his legacy, his Ghazwa, his holy conquest. Instead, it had become his private hell. The nights were the worst. He would pace the marble floors of his chambers, the silence broken only by the lapping of the Bosphorus waves, waves that now seemed to carry the ghosts of his drowned sailors. He had always been a student of astrology, seeking guidance in the stars. Now, he saw only ill omens, cosmic confirmation of his ruin. His health, never robust, began to fail him. The stress manifested in physical ailments, a constant pain that mirrored the agony of his empire. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him. Every whisper in the divan, every glance from a courtier, felt like a judgment or a plot. He had sacrificed his Grand Vizier, but the relief was fleeting. The faces of his generals haunted him, their dispatches filled with news of retreat and surrender. He poured his anguish into his poetry, writing under the pen name Cihangir. His verses, once filled with hope and imperial ambition, now spoke of fate's cruelty, of betrayal, and of the burdens of a crown that felt heavier than a mountain. This was the profound isolation of absolute power. Surrounded by hundreds, he was utterly alone with the consequences of his decisions. He was the caliph, the shadow of God on earth, yet he was powerless to stop the bleeding of his realm. His world had shrunk from a mighty empire to the confines of his own tortured mind. The final humiliation was yet to come. The time for arrogance and holy war was over. The time for supplication had begun. With the Russian army pushing towards the Danube and threatening the road to Constantinople itself, Mustafa III was forced to do the unthinkable, sue for peace. But he could not beg his nemesis, Catherine the Great, directly. The shame would be too great. Instead, the Sublime Porte turned to its traditional rival, and sometimes ally, in Europe, Prussia, under Frederick the Great. Ottoman envoys, stripped of their customary hauteur, were dispatched to Berlin. Their mission was not to negotiate from a position of strength, but to plead for intervention. They were to ask Frederick to mediate, to implore him to persuade Catherine to show mercy. It was a staggering reversal of roles. For centuries, European powers had come to Constantinople to request favors from the mighty Sultan. Now, the Sultan's men were the ones bowing in foreign courts, their desperation thinly veiled by diplomatic protocol. The reports coming back to Mustafa were bleak. Frederick, the master of realpolitik, saw opportunity in Ottoman weakness, not a reason for charity. He, along with Austria, was more interested in carving up Poland with Russia than in saving the Ottomans from them. The preliminary terms floated by the Russians were devastating. They demanded the independence of Crimea, the ancestral lands of the Tatars, and a vital buffer for the empire. They demanded navigation rights through the Turkish Straits and the role of protector for the Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, a direct license to interfere in imperial affairs. For Mustafa, each condition was a dagger to the heart of his sovereignty and his faith. He was no longer dictating terms to the infidel. He was begging the enemy to leave him with the scraps of his own empire. For 3 centuries, the Crimean Khanate had been more than a vassal to the Ottoman Empire. It was a kindred spirit, a bulwark of the Turkic world, and the sharpest fang of the Sultan's power in the north. Its horsemen were the stuff of legend, a swift and terrible force that had guarded the northern frontiers and raided deep into the heart of Poland and Muscovy. The bond was not merely political. It was a shared heritage, a spiritual and cultural brotherhood forged in the fires of history. But in the brutal campaigns of 1771, this ancient bond was not merely strained, it was violently severed. Catherine the Great's general, Vasily Dolgorukov, smashed through the Perekop Isthmus, the gateway to the peninsula, with an army that was disciplined, modern, and utterly relentless. The Ottoman and Tatar forces, brave but outmaneuvered and outgunned, were swept aside. One by one, the ancient cities fell. Kaffa, Kersh, and finally, the symbolic heart of the Khanate, the garden city of Bakhchisarai. The news that struck Constantinople was not just of a military defeat, it was a sacrilege. Russian soldiers were walking through the halls of the Khan's palace, the sacred mosques were being desecrated, and the very soul of Crimea was being extinguished. For Mustafa III, this was a catastrophe beyond measure. It was as if a limb had been torn from the body of the empire. The Black Sea, for so long an Ottoman lake, was now breached, its northern shore in the hands of the infidel. The loss was a profound psychological blow, a public humiliation that echoed from the coffeehouses of Istanbul to the courts of Europe. The empire had lost territories before, but it had never lost a land so deeply intertwined with its own identity. Crimea was the first major Muslim territory to be conquered by a resurgent Christian power, a terrifying omen of what was to come. The Sultan had gone to war to restore prestige. Instead, he had presided over the amputation of the empire's northern soul. Inside the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace, Sultan Mustafa III was a prisoner of his own ambition. The man who had ascended the throne with dreams of rivaling Suleiman the Magnificent now faced a reality of unparalleled disaster. Every dispatch from the front brought news of another defeat, another fortress lost, another army shattered. The war he had so confidently initiated had become a voracious beast, devouring his men, his treasury, and his sanity. The crown, once a symbol of divine authority, now felt like a leaden weight, pressing down on him, crushing his spirit. His days were consumed by frantic, often contradictory efforts. He poured his personal fortune into the war effort, attempting to mint new coins from palace silver, a desperate measure that did little to stem the tide of bankruptcy. He lashed out at his commanders, dismissing grand viziers and generals in a revolving door of blame, unable to accept that the fatal flaw might lie in the very fabric of the empire he commanded. His nights offered no respite. Sleep became a luxury he could not afford, his mind racing with visions of Russian armies marching on Constantinople itself. He was haunted by the ghosts of his glorious ancestors, their portraits seeming to mock him from the palace walls. He, the Caliph, the protector of the faithful, was watching as Muslim lands fell under Christian dominion. This was not just a political failure, it was a spiritual one. The psychological toll was immense. Once a robust and decisive ruler, Mustafa became increasingly paranoid, withdrawn, and reliant on the whispers of astrologers over the counsel of his ministers. The weight of the empire, the burden of a failing war, and the shame of his miscalculation were a poison seeping into his very being. The crown was no longer a symbol of power, but a testament to his powerlessness, a crushing reminder that he was the Sultan who was losing everything. As the physical world crumbled around him, Mustafa III retreated ever deeper into the realm of the unseen. A man of deep piety, he had always held a fascination for mysticism, astrology, and prophecy. Now, with his armies in disarray and his advisors offering no viable solutions, these esoteric arts became his primary counsel. The atmosphere in Constantinople grew thick with dread and superstition. Rumors spread through the city like a fever, tales of comets blazing across the night sky, of strange births, of ancient prophecies being unearthed that foretold the fall of the city. The Sultan, far from dismissing these whispers, became their most ardent believer. He surrounded himself with sheikhs and dervishes, men who claimed to see the future in the alignment of the stars or the swirl of smoke from a censer. One particular prophecy, said to have been passed down from the time of the great conqueror Sultan Mehmed II, gained a terrifying currency in the palace. It spoke of a blonde race from the north that would one day humble the House of Osman and lay siege to the city of Constantine. For generations, this was a vague and distant warning. But now, with Catherine the Great's armies pushing relentlessly south, the prophecy felt chillingly immediate and real. Mustafa reportedly spent hours poring over celestial charts, seeking a sign, any sign, that fate might yet be reversed. He ordered prayers and sacrifices, hoping to appease a heaven that seemed to have abandoned him. This turn towards fatalism was a symptom of his complete desperation. Having failed as a strategist and a statesman, he was now searching for meaning in his ruin, casting himself not as a failed commander-in-chief, but as a tragic figure caught in the inexorable grip of destiny. The war was no longer just a contest of armies. It was a cosmic event, a divine judgment being enacted upon his empire. And in the dark alignment of the stars, Mustafa saw not hope, but the confirmation of his deepest fear, that his reign was cursed, and his destiny was to preside over the beginning of the end. By the winter of 1773, the war was irretrievably lost. The Ottoman armies were a spent force, broken at Larga, Kagul, and Chesma. The treasury was a hollowed-out cavern of debt. The Russian war machine, far from being exhausted, was now dictating terms from a position of absolute strength. For Mustafa III, this was the final, agonizing stage of his humiliation. The negotiations for peace were not a dialogue between equals, but the pronouncement of a sentence upon a vanquished foe. The Russian demands, delivered with cold imperial arrogance, were designed to dismantle Ottoman power in the Black Sea and cripple its sovereignty forever. First, the complete and total independence of the Crimean Tatars. This was a transparent fiction. Everyone knew an independent Crimea would be a Russian puppet, a dagger pointed permanently at the empire's heart. Second, vast territorial concessions, granting Russia control over key ports and fortresses along the northern Black Sea coast. Third, enormous war reparations that would chain the Ottoman economy to Russian interests for decades. But the cruelest and most insidious demand was the final one. Russia was to be granted the right to act as the official protector of the Orthodox Christian subjects within the Ottoman Empire. This was a masterstroke of geopolitical sabotage, giving the Tsar a permanent, legal pretext to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs at will. It was a poison pill inserted directly into the core of Ottoman sovereignty. Mustafa saw the abyss opening before him. To accept these terms was to sign the death warrant of the empire's prestige and autonomy. To refuse was to invite the Russian army to march on his capital. In his final months, the Sultan was a broken man, trapped between ruin and annihilation. The physical and mental strain proved too much. In January 1774, as his diplomats were preparing to accept the inevitable, Mustafa III died of a heart attack. He was spared the final indignity of putting his seal on the document of his failure, the Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca. But it was his legacy all the same, a bitter piece that codified his disastrous underestimation of Russia and set the Ottoman Empire on a century-long path of decline.